My name is Karen Dace, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Diversity here at the University of Utah. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's keynote presentation, which is part of the university's Women's Week activities. Women's Week is an annual opportunity for the university and the community to celebrate the accomplishments of women and explore issues germane to women today. This year's theme for Women's Week is Breaking Boundaries, the puzzle of violence against women. If you have been in attendance at some of this week's events, you know that we have had an exciting week. As we near the end of this year's activities, please keep in mind the University of Utah's Performing Dance Company's program in connection with Kyoko Ibe's paper sculpture tonight, Friday, and Saturday evening at Marriott Center for Dance. In addition, as part of Women's Week, we are completing a service project to collect items of need for the YWCA's Battered Women's Shelter. We are still accepting donations of new items such as women's and children's clothing, blankets, toys, and toiletries. You can drop these items off through today at the Women's Resource Center, the Utah Museum of Natural History, Career Services Center, Public Information Office at the University Hospital, and the Student Apartment Office. These items will be delivered tomorrow to the YWCA. Women's Week activities would not be possible without support from our sponsors, the Office of the President, the Senior Vice Presidents for Academic Affairs and Health Sciences, the Women's Studies Program, Women's Resource Center, ASUU Presenter's Office, and the Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Fund. Before the introduction of our keynote speaker, I would like to make a presentation. Last year, the President's Commission on the Status of Women presented the first award in recognition of a woman on campus with an outstanding record of service and commitment to women in the University of Utah community. That award went to then Dean of Nursing, Linda Amos. This year, the President's Commission and the Women's Week Planning Committee joined forces to select another University of Utah woman who enhanced the role of women on this campus. In addition, the award has been named for the first recipient. This afternoon, I have the honor of presenting the Linda Amos Award to former University of Utah coach and administrator Fern Gardner. As I tell you about Fern, it will become apparent that she is a pioneer. She was not only one of the first, but one of the most prominent collegiate female administrators. She was also one of the first great female coaches in the country, racking up 319 wins in coaching women's basketball teams at Utah State and the University of Utah. As an athlete, she was in a class by herself. Fern Gardner was one of the finest fast-pitch softball players ever produced in the state of Utah and was a star pitcher on one of the top amateur teams in the country, the Utah Shamrocks. As an outstanding student athlete at Utah State University, she starred on the Aggie basketball, softball, tennis, and volleyball teams. In 8 years as the women's basketball coach at the University of Utah, she averaged an amazing 22 wins a season. She also made 8 trips to the national tournament and was named Region 7 Coach of the Year 3 times. When Fern Gardner came to the University of Utah in 1975, she served the dual role of women's basketball coach and women's athletic director. In 1983, she gave up the coaching reins and was named assistant athletics director. An excellent administrator, Fern Gardner was responsible for NCAA compliance, academic advising, rules interpretation, and athlete eligibility. Nationally, she served on a number of NCAA committees. Fern Gardner has been inducted into the Utah Softball Hall of Fame, the Utah Sports Hall of Fame, the Utah State University Athletic Hall of Fame, and the Utah Summer Games Hall of Fame. More recently, she was chosen as one of the top 50 athletes in the 20th century in the state of Utah by Sports Illustrated, and was a member of the first induction class of the Utah State Basketball Hall of Fame. Fern Gardner retired from the university in 1996. She keeps active in sports and won the gold medal in golf for her age group in the 1997 and 1998 Senior Games. A native of Deweyville, Fern Gardner now resides in St. George. Here to accept the award on behalf of Fern Gardner is Kathy Brooks, Director of the Women's Resource Center.
When we first began talking with Fern about giving her this award, she was so excited and has been gone from the campus several years, so I think was quite an unsuspecting awardee, but thrilled and in her usual quiet way downplayed the award and downplayed her role. So it was with great delight when she asked me if I would step in and accept the award, because I can talk about her and I can say things that Fern wouldn't say about herself. But I need to tell you that throughout the decade, the late 70s and into the 80s, Fern's reputation as a leader in women's athletics was well known across this country. When I accepted the job here in 1989, one of the side effects of that was getting to work with Fern, and I knew I would. And I knew it was a place that we could be a strong team. And I've always been interested in women's athletics. I had watched Fern as a basketball coach. My daughter had watched her. I had known what an exceptional athlete she was and what an exceptional coach she was. And her reputation had already spread throughout the West in terms of the steady, strong leadership that she provided for this campus. We are celebrating on this campus this year 25 years of women's athletics. Part of the reason that they are strong and have stayed steady is Fern's leadership. I'd like to acknowledge two of her colleagues, Chris Hill, the Director of Athletics, and Amy Hackett, the new Associate Director of Athletics, although she's now been here 3 years, Amy. They are sitting here behind us. So there has been a team in athletics who really was committed to women achieving their potential. Fern led us out. She led us through some very rugged moments. Chris and I can smile to some of those. It's been an interesting decade. But she was always there. Took one phone call, and Fern had an answer. She had an ability to get the pieces together, to think it through and come up with a solution. And it was a phone call that went two ways. So I honor her. I am delighted we have been able to recognize what she has given this campus over the years. And I invite you to participate in the events later in the spring. Fern lives in St. George. She is not here all the time, but she will be back later this spring. And we will be sure that she takes her award and her presentations home with her when she returns. So again, it's my honor, my privilege, and if you can participate in some of the events, you'll get to know Fern. She has been absolutely an amazing gift to this campus.
We are presenting Fern with a Nambe Bowl and a book on 20th century women's history. Now, will you please welcome Sara George, the director of the Utah Museum of Natural History and the Planetarium, and this year's Women's Week chairperson.
Just a little bit of business first. I want to let you know that immediately after questions, after the keynote, Sara Paretsky will be signing her books in the rear of the room, and you can purchase them if you don't have them. I also want to thank the members of the Women's Week Committee. This is actually my second year chairing the committee, and it's a fantastic group of people that have put on a wonderful array of events ranging from service project to jazz concerts to dance concerts to keynote speakers to panels, and I really have to let you all know how much I appreciate everything you've done. It's a very great honor to be able to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this year's Women's Week, Sara Paretsky. I've been asked why the committee chose a mystery writer as the keynote for our theme, Breaking Boundaries, the Puzzle of Violence Against Women. It didn't really seem to lend itself to the writing of fiction for the mass market. However, for those of us who are fans of V.I. Warshawski, and who knows what V.I. stands for? Victoria Iphigenia. And especially to those of us who've read Sara Paretsky's latest book, Hard Time, we know how sensitive she is about this terrible issue. Sara Paretsky published her first Warshawski book, Indemnity Only, in 1982, and I remember it well. I was a graduate student when I discovered it, and I spent much of a week sneaking out of the lab during lulls in activity to read it because I just couldn't tear myself away. Sara Paretsky was one of the groundbreaking writers using the female PI as a protagonist, and her smart, provocative series has stretched into 9 books and I hope will continue to go strong. 2 years ago, she took a diversion to explore some other voices and published Ghost Country, which is a third-person novel that explores issues around homelessness and mental illness. She's been an active proponent for women mystery writers and is a founding member of Sisters in Crime, which is a consortium that's published, I think, 5 collections so far of short stories. Sara Paretsky has a wide variety of awards, including Ms. Magazine's Woman of the Year and the Mark Twain Award for her distinguished contributions to Midwestern literature. She has had visiting fellowships at Oxford and at Northwestern. Born in Iowa, raised in Kansas, she's been in Chicago for more than 30 years, and I would say that's a pretty Midwestern background. And she has earned her doctorate in history at the University of Chicago. We are delighted and honored to have Sara Paretsky with us today and look forward to hearing her speak on women, speech, and silence. I ask you to join me in welcoming Sara Paretsky.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Karen Dace, and everyone here for your hospitality during this very important week. And thank you, Deborah, for the water, which will keep me going. I didn't realize how very Midwestern I really am until I heard my interview with Doug Fabrizio this morning on NPR and heard that Midwestern twang, which is very definitely part of me, and I didn't have time to get to a speech therapist before today's speech, so you'll just have to bear with it. I also was very entertained by Sarah George's mentioning sneaking out of her classes to read my book. I was very flattered by that because the month before my doctor's orals at the University of Chicago many decades ago, I holed up in the U of C library stacks and read 24 crime novels. And that's why I always try to do really careful research, because I read a lot of English crime novels and my minor field committees were in English history, and I think that it was the fictional work that helped me know enough to pass the exams. You've had a week of distinguished and thought-provoking speeches and panels, and I don't know how much I can really contribute. I think based on what I've heard of what's been discussed, that a lot of what I have to say is a kind of a summing up of what's already been discussed this week. We live in a very exciting time for women. Doors are open that we fought long and hard to open, and young women can walk through them easily without any let or hindrance. And it's a wonderful thing for a woman of my generation to have lived to see these kinds of opportunities available. We also live at a time when young women are so fearful of taking up space that eating disorders are at an all-time high. More people die from anorexia than from any other mental illness. So we sort of have these two very confusing things going on at the same time. A lot of opportunity, a lot of fearfulness. My remarks on this subject I've gathered together under the title of There's Something About Mary. There's something about Mary that causes men to stalk her. Remember that sleeper hit of 1998, the year's top grossing film, when Cameron Diaz has 5 guys obsessed with her, tapping her phone, hiring private eyes to train telescopes on her, pretending to be delivery boys so that they can get access to her home. As we watch the movie, Ben Stiller, the hero and narrator, who is Mary's first stalker, keeps reminding us that it's Mary's fault that this is going on. There's something about Mary that makes her responsible for the 5 guys who are after her. There's something that makes Mary undress in front of an open window, makes her wear baby doll t-shirts and giggle with unconcern when she talks to the menacing men in her life, even though she's a brain surgeon, even though one stalker was so terrifying that she had to change her name and move across country to get away from him. There's something about Mary that means she isn't affected at a deep level by violence and threats of violence, something that doesn't feel fully human, fully adult. I've been wondering if it's her sex, if it's the fact that she's of the female persuasion. Women's estate has changed dramatically in the decades since I was a college student. In 1965, college-bound young women were told that we were going off to school to get an MRS degree. At a university, you were expected to marry, and to marry someone with better earning power than you would find if you only finished high school. We were also told we were going to university to make us better wives and mothers. Indeed, when Yale University first opened its ivied halls to women in 1969, Yale's president assured furious alums who were canceling their bequests in droves. He assured them in an article in the Sunday New York Times magazine that the school was only admitting women to make them better wives and mothers. Well, I imagine that every young woman in this room came to college because of what education can do for her, to help make her a deeper thinking person, a better contributor to society, able to get a job commensurate with her abilities, not to take part in the middle-class equivalent of a debutante's ball. I'm proud of today's young women as they make confident choices about their lives. The last 35 years have seen sweeping legal changes. The government requires us to fund women's athletic programs at universities. And even though the NCAA women's tournament took a back page in newspapers and on television, you could still watch women play basketball on a national network. Unheard of in my day. More important changes. Women can borrow money now on their own. 30 years ago, if you were single, you had to jump through hoops higher than the Jazz's basketball net to buy a home. And if you were married, you were absolutely unable under the law to get credit in your own name. When I was in college, single women could not get contraceptives. You could be 40 years old, but if you were unmarried, the law forbade your doctor to prescribe a diaphragm or the pill for you. Many married women had to justify their desire for contraceptives to a tribunal of doctors. Abortion was against the law in all but 3 states, and in 2 of those states you needed a psychiatrist to say that pregnancy would unhinge your mental balance. It's true that the fight for safe and legal abortion is ongoing and exhausting, that poor women do not have access to abortion in 3/4 of the nation, that minor women's access is severely restricted in many states, but it is still legal. None of you will have to, as I did at the age of 23, go looking for a friend and find her at 2 in the morning, hemorrhaging and almost dead on a crowded city street. When I graduated from the University of Kansas, women earned about 57 cents for every dollar men made. With my BA, the only job I could find, and I tried both in New York and Chicago, was as a secretary. My generation had to fight for management trainee positions, for admission to business schools, which were closed to women until around 1970, for admission to medical and law schools, which generally felt that more than 10 women in a class would lower their intellectual standards. Now all fields are open to you. Women sit on the Supreme Court, fly the space shuttle, act as detectives. One flew my plane to Salt Lake City yesterday. Another is even heading Hewlett-Packard. Medical and law school classes around the country are generally evenly shared by men and women. Your entry-level salary will probably be the same as that of your male peers, and even 10 years down the road, you will average about 78 cents for his dollar instead of 57. At this rate, as I calculate it, we can expect pay equity by 2034, just in time for my great-granddaughter to hit the workforce. That's progress, though. It is progress indeed. There have been other giant leaps forward. 30 years ago, the court said that domestic violence was a private matter between a man and a woman and would not interfere. The first shelters for battered women are about 3 decades old. When I was in college, the law said that a rapist could be exonerated if his victim had a previous sexual history. There were no rape crisis centers. There were no hotlines. However imperfectly the courts, the police, and the medical community may act these days, the law has changed. It's on our side. So what is it about Cameron Diaz that makes her giggle and play with the little girl bow on her baby doll t-shirt when she's confronting her stalkers? What is it about Julia Roberts that makes her play Erin Brockovich in a low-cut, tight-fitting top that looks like a calico corset above a mini that makes the clothes of the 60s look like a Victorian wardrobe? What is it about Julia that makes her use heroin to keep herself at a skeletal weight? What is it about Mary? The Farrelly brothers, with assistance from 2 other men, wrote the screenplay for Mary. We might speculate then that the movie represents a male fantasy, that of an immature male whose idea of humor is an untiring repetition of jokes about penises stuck in zippers. We might speculate that Hollywood, where most writers and directors are men, produces a series of male fantasies about women. My own experience when Disney made a film allegedly based on my character was that the studio refused to allow women scriptwriters to work on it, and that the 4 men who actually completed the script inserted endless, tiresome bathroom jokes into it. We know what that fantasy is, that no matter whether a woman has a job, say as a brain surgeon in Cameron Diaz's case, an architect in the case of Glenn Close's character in Fatal Attraction, or a hooker, as Sharon Stone played in Basic Instinct, that the woman basically is really a hooker. She exists only in the body, not the mind. She's an animal with amazing athleticism, but without the capacity to feel things deeply. She can be stalked, as Ben Stiller does to Cameron Diaz in Mary, or beaten up, as Al Pacino does to Ellen Barkin in Sea of Love. But she won't hold a grudge. She'll go off with the guy in the end, because she doesn't experience life and loss as deeply as an adult male does. In fact, in a perverse way, as women have become stronger in many arenas over the past 3 decades, the images of degradation against women have also become stronger. Katharine Hepburn and Rosalind Russell didn't have to act like hookers to play convincing career women in the 40s, but Cameron Diaz and Julia Roberts do today. Guns N' Roses can put out an album with a cover showing a woman who has obviously just been raped, with the announcement, "Guns N' Roses was here," Hundreds of thousands of young women around the globe bought that thing 10 years ago, just as they did Michael Jackson's video, The Way You Make Me Feel, in which a woman is attracted and responsive to a man who has been stalking her. My own experience as a writer closely follows this national history. I have taken part in an exciting epoch in women's storytelling. When I started reading mysteries as a teenager, women characters played one of the 4 V's: virgins, victims, vamps, or villains. I guess my detective tries to redress that by being the 5th V. Basically, a woman who was a vamp was inevitably a villain. She could act, but she could only do bad things. You knew when you met a widow or a divorcee that she was going to be rotten because she had sexual experience. Virgins never did anything bad, but they couldn't act for good either. Notable 20th century heroines include Carmen Sternwood of Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. The first time Carmen sees Philip Marlowe in the hallway of her father's house, she greets him just as you or I might welcome a stranger. She turned her body slowly and lithely without lifting her feet. Her hands dropped limp at her sides. She tilted herself toward me on her toes. She fell straight back into my arms. I had to catch her or let her crack her head on the tessellated floor. I caught her under her arms, and she went rubber-legged on me instantly. I had to hold her close to hold her up. When her head was against my chest, she screwed it around and giggled at me. Don't try this maneuver at home without adult supervision. All through this century, indeed throughout the millennia, imaginary women have been using their bodies to try to make good boys do bad things. But as Marlowe was in The Big Sleep, the heroes have been too strong for us. The definition of women's morality and effectiveness based on our sexuality continues today, both in the crime novel and in the so-called mainstream novel. For instance, a few years ago, the Czech dissident Josef Paretsky wrote a widely hailed novel about the Prague Spring of 1968 and the betrayal of the Czech dissidents. In the miracle game, it turns out that the corruption in the Czech government and the crushing of the Prague Spring were all due to the duplicity of a highly sexed female student who worked for the secret police, had sex with her professors and colleagues as well as with the police, and then betrayed all of her friends. One wonders how she ever got any rest from all this activity. Well, it shouldn't surprise us that movies and popular music share the same outlook. Popular music is rife with bitches and hoes who need punishing and taming. How can these things exist side by side? The success of women in so many arenas, my own success in breaking down stereotypes of women in fiction, women who are challenging rap music stereotypes. How can that exist side by side with the degradation of women in so much popular culture? It's almost as if the more public space we women take up, the more some parts of society react by trying to force us into silence. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony believed that if we had the vote and if we had economic independence, all other problems would be solved. But every gain we make in the legal and the economic sphere seems to increase the violence of opposition. It's as if when we finally strip away the legal and economic barriers facing women, the underlying fear and anger against them cannot call itself by any other name. We see this very starkly in the amount of violence committed against women in America. Domestic violence is widespread throughout the world. In the United States, it's the most common cause of injuries to women, accounting for more trauma than car or ski accidents, muggings, and other accidents combined. 2.5 million women a year suffer violent physical assault in America. 2/3 of them, about 1.8 million women a year, are attacked by an intimate, a father, a brother, a boyfriend. Every year, some 700,000 American women are raped. That is one assault for every 170 women, 1,400 a day, week in, week out. The younger a female is, the more likely she is to be attacked. About half of all rapes are committed against girls under 18 years old. Despite the changes in the law, the existence of crisis centers, hotlines, specially trained police units, we still live in a culture that glorifies violence against women and tolerates it against little girls. There are no reliable data on how many little girls are sexually assaulted in this country each year. But according to a recent United Nations report on violence against women in 140 countries, it is between 1/3 and 1/4. That's here in America, 1 in 4 of our daughters. I know to my personal sorrow that boys also experience sexual abuse with grave consequences for their lives. But the sheer numbers of abused women and girls exact a staggering personal and social toll in the United States. The sexual abuse of women is a line that runs through poverty and prison. This abuse is not the only reason that some women cannot find work or abuse drugs or end up behind bars, but it's a strong contributor. 1/2 of all women in American prisons can remember childhood sexual abuse. 70% of women in American prison are there for nonviolent offenses, most commonly for drug possession, not drug sales. It is not surprising that they turn to drugs to numb themselves. Welfare caseworkers are only starting to realize the extent of childhood sexual abuse that lies in the background of their most intractable clients. These women are too depressed, too fragmented by their childhood violations to be able to hold jobs. At the same time, girls who have been sexually abused are more likely to end up with abusive partners as adults, dragging them even deeper into depression and fragmentation. A woman on welfare cannot afford the kind of psychotherapy it takes to overcome such trauma. And I hope you don't imagine that it's available for women in prison. But rape and abuse are not the exclusive domain of poor women. Every year, at least 1 in 8 college women are sexually assaulted on campus, almost always by someone that she knows. Some data banks report that as many as 1/4 of all college women are raped every year. In the wake of these numbing facts about the physical and sexual abuse of women and children, some people have decided that the real fault lies with feminists. Indeed, when Marc Lepine killed 14 women in a Montreal classroom several years ago, he said it because he was unemployed and they were all a bunch of feminists. The New Yorker says that Julia Roberts' new movie, the one where she takes on Pacific Gas while clad only in a calico wonder bra and a micro mini, puts the last nail in feminism's coffin. Hard to understand why or how, but there you have it. More seriously, the Wall Street Journal has led the hue and cry against feminism for 3 decades now. They and other right-wing pundits have been remarkably successful in making a new generation of young women scared to call themselves feminists. A fusillade of criticism against feminism from the right claims that women who want to explore the world outside the home, to explore and use their own talents, are responsible for everything from a high incidence of venereal disease to Littleton, Colorado. Indeed, the House Majority Whip Tom DeLay got up in Congress last spring to blame the shooting in Littleton on two things: teaching evolution in the public schools and women working outside the home. We now have a whole bevy of women in their 20s and 30s who are denouncing feminism. Women like Renee Denfield, whose book The New Victorians proclaims, quote, "It is the aura of stridency and intolerance and not a sexist backlash that has driven young women away from the feminist movement." Or young Danielle Crittenden, whose book What Our Mothers Didn't Tell Us says that women need to be home having babies when they're in their 20s, that feminism has only confused young women by trying to say that you could, like Natalie Ginsburg or Sandra Day O'Connor, be both a mom and a Supreme Court justice. In the book The New Modesty, the author proclaims that women like me have caused sexual violence to increase by stripping women of the protection of chaperones. Actually, my mother-in-law, who was born in 1883, said the invention of the bicycle got rid of the chaperone because it was the first time that a middle-class woman could move faster than her chaperone could. But at least in the opinion of some of these young writers of today, it seems like there's something about Mary that if she isn't kept suppressed, separate, chaperoned, at home, pregnant, that she will cause men to rape her. We're even getting a pseudoscientific gloss on Mary from the neo-Darwinians. In A Natural History of Rape, published to strong reviews this past January, MIT professors Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer claim that rape is beyond men's ability to control. The authors say that people everywhere understand sex to be something that women have and that men want. These are scientists. The book's authors think the Taliban in Afghanistan may be onto something when they put women in total isolation. Because men are utterly at the mercy of their hormones, women will inevitably tempt them. Because men are powerless, women must be secluded. In other words, there's something about Mary that makes her an unself-conscious, but nonetheless utterly blamable cause of the violence that men wreak on her. Frankly, I think this view is even more offensive to men than it is to women by suggesting that men are merciless in the face of their hormones. Are helpless in the face of their hormones. Today's young anti-feminists like Danielle Crittenden or Ariana Huffington continue in the tradition of Phyllis Schlafly. That is, they are wealthy, they have live-in household help to look after their children, while they pursue powerful careers in journalism, law, and politics, and make a living speaking out against women who don't stay home to look after their children. What the household help does with her own children is never explained. There seems to be a subtext that caring for the family of the wealthy is a reward in itself. Danielle Crittenden, who can't imagine the barriers that could have kept her out of law or journalism school 30 years ago, is annoyed with women like me for making her life so confusing. Imagine the confusion she'll feel if her words start falling like stones down a bottomless well. When your words drop without sound so that they seem weightless, you yourself begin to feel insubstantial, ghost-like. That is the world in which I grew up. It is not the one I wish to bequeath to my granddaughter. For conservative publications like the Wall Street Journal, writers like Denfield and Crittenden are a heaven-sent answer to the upheaval generated by the international feminist conspiracy. For 3 decades, the journal has been blaming feminists for everything from an increase in street crime to an increase in rape. Indeed, the journal published one op-ed essay which claimed that feminists create rape where none exists, solely in order to agitate other women. Another essay claimed that rape crisis centers are deliberately decorated in tawdry ways to keep rape victims in a constant state of man-hating depression. Tell that to a woman who's trying to run a crisis center on an annual budget less than the publisher of Dow Jones makes in one day. Tell that to one of your friends who's been assaulted, and you'll probably find that you've only added to her sense of guilt and shame for being the victim of violence. This constant barrage against women is having a depressing amount of success. Of course, I'm not a feminist either. I only believe in equal pay, equal opportunity. I only believe that women should be treated seriously as human beings, with the idea that we are adult enough to make the most important decisions about our bodies and our lives without the state stepping in to play the role of daddy and telling us what's best for us. I only believe in women's right to inhabit space, to speak, to be listened to be attended to. When the first thing you see leaving the airport in Chicago or Houston is a big billboard with a sexually available woman plastered on it, telling you that there's a scenic overlook right ahead at Hooters, you know exactly what role the restaurant is imagining for you, the woman. It doesn't matter if you're a brain surgeon, because we know that, like Cameron Diaz, you only exist in the body. These messages have an inevitably confusing effect on young women. For better or worse, we get our ideas about how we should act and dress from the popular pictures of women. In Girls on the Verge, when the author Vendela Vida was pledging the Tri-Delt sorority at UCLA, she attended a keg party at a fraternity. The boy handing out beer said that the first drink would go to the woman with the lowest cut t-shirt. The Tri-Delts, who were all wearing their Cameron Diaz baby doll t-shirts, promptly began pulling them down low enough to show their nipples. They knew, these college women, how to dress and how to act in order to be popular, socially acceptable, how to fit in both with their sorority sisters and with the fraternity brothers. And the young men themselves, they're the ones who are raping one of every 4 or 6 or 8 college students each year. They know that enough alcohol or enough Ripnahol will render a woman unable to say no to sex. And then the woman has the confusing dilemma to sort out about whether she caused the rape, whether she really consented by being there, by dressing like Julia Roberts. Words and pictures are powerful. Make no mistake about it. It's not just to create jobs that America spends more on advertising each year than the gross national products of all of Africa and India combined. It's because words and pictures change people's behavior. The same is true then of movies and videos, of books. A group of young women college students who watched Michael Jackson's video, The Way You Make Me Feel, filled out questions before and after seeing it. In the video, a man stalks a beautiful woman down a dark city street. At first, she is afraid and tries to run away, but then she realizes that his stalking her is a wonderful compliment, and she succumbs to him, especially when he is presented as an alternative to a gang rape. After watching the video, most of the young women came away with the idea that violence against women was an acceptable part of heterosexual relations. These were college students. These are the ones going to parties wondering if they're likable, if they're acceptable, if it's all right to say no to a man. They're the ones who are facing a 1 in 4 or 1 in 8 chance of being raped. In the face of this cultural onslaught, it's not surprising that young women don't want to be feminists. It's even less surprising that they try to make themselves invisible. They starve themselves or take heroin to be bone thin or work out obsessively so they won't take up space. If they can't disappear altogether, they dress in little girl clothes, a submissive gesture that says, I'm not an adult presence, I'm not really a threat. They pull down their t-shirts so boys can see their nipples. See, it's okay. I'm not really going to compete with you. I understand what the Farrelly brothers and Hooters and have been telling me, that I'm really only a body. I'm not immune to these pressures. They operated powerfully throughout my childhood in a conservative corner of rural Kansas to make me afraid to speak, to take up space. These pressures to silence me kept me so uncertain about my voice that even though I had written from my earliest childhood, I did not begin to try to write for publication until I was 32 years old. If it had not been for the support of the women's movement, I don't know if I ever would have created V.I. Warshawski or been here talking to you about speech and silence. From my first reading of American hard-boiled novels in my early 20s, I knew I wanted to create a female detective who turned the tables on these negative images of women. But I lived then in a world of daydreams. I could imagine myself with a finished book in print, but I couldn't imagine myself actually writing it. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s, working as a manager for CNA Insurance in Chicago, that I actually sat down to turn the stories I told in my head into what you see in print. When I started work on my first book, Indemnity Only, it was with the definite goal of creating a female detective who was a person, not an angel or a monster. But I wasn't thinking of what it meant to be a woman hero in a positive way. I knew what I didn't want my detective to be, but not what she should be. The one aspect I was thinking about consciously was her sexuality and the role of sex in my stories. Serial killers who torture women or children, rapists who prey on women and children, play an enormously titillating role in today's fiction. I vowed not to use sex to exploit my characters or my readers. I also wanted my hero, V.I., to be a sexual being and a moral person at the same time. V.I.'s emotional involvements do sometimes cloud her judgments. That's a fact of life for men and women both. V.I. does have lovers, but her sexuality does not prohibit her from making clear moral judgments and acting on them. For women to find a voice telling them that they may have adventures, that action is women's appropriate sphere, has been the difficult task of the last several centuries. The barrage of imagery urging us to silence, indeed implying that rape and dismemberment are appropriate responses to women who speak, is difficult to overcome. I know in my own case, the effort to find and sustain a voice has been exhausting. But let me assure you of this. When you speak and when you are heard, you are committing a political act. Those who are silent, who are silenced, have no access to change, to choice, or control of their lives. It is no coincidence that the Taliban, that most fiercely repressive of all religious regimes, have silenced Afghani women completely. Afghani women must whisper when they are at home and must not make a single sound in public. If even their footfalls are heard, they are flogged. The overwhelming effect of the Farrelly brothers, of much of rap music, of Hooters, is to try to force women into silence. We in this room must pledge here today that we will speak. We will not be silenced. We will be heard. For me, the true heroes are those who speak more than those who act. My own heroine, V.I., is a woman of action, but her primary role is to speak. She says those things which I am not strong enough to say myself. That's why she can grow older, unlike most fictional detectives, because her success depends not so much on what she does, but on her willingness to put into words things that other people would rather remain unspoken. I am myself not heroic. I get the shakes when I have to face angry or disapproving people. I find it hard to say no to people when they demand of me that which I don't wish to do. Too often I've been bullied out of supporting people or ideas that are important to me, but my heroine has a voice. It's no coincidence that the success of Title VII legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as amended, which gave us all of these opportunities, coincides with the legitimization of fearful violence against women in novels and movies. It's no coincidence that violence has increased in homes and dormitories as well. If we women cannot be silenced through the courts, if despite social pressure we continue to find our voice, then there are those who will try to terrorize us into silence. I say this not to blame women or the women's revolution for violence against women. On the contrary, I am a fierce advocate for speech, regardless of the price one pays for speaking. I want you to be aware, though, of the hazards that attend us as we try to find our voice, as we shout in an effort to be heard. It will not become easier for women in this new century. It may even become more difficult. But if we are aware of the danger facing us, of the efforts to silence us, then we will not be silenced so easily. Near the end of the 19th century, the Japanese poet Yosano Akiko was born to a woman who had just lost her young son to illness. Yosano's father, enraged at the birth of a daughter, demanded that his wife kill her. The mother instead smuggled Yosano out of the house to be raised by an aunt, visiting her daughter at every opportunity, and finally persuading her husband to allow her to bring the girl back to her own family when she was 5. Perhaps it was the love and courage of her mother which enabled Yosano to find her writing voice. Around 1910, she wrote, "The day when the mountain will move is coming. When I say this, no one believes me. The mountains have been asleep only temporarily. In antiquity, mountains, all aflame, moved about. No one need believe this, but all of you believe this. All the women who had been asleep have now awakened and are on the move." This is our urgent task as women, to speak, to listen, to be those mountains which have awakened. We must say to Mary or Julia Roberts or Hooters, "There isn't something about me that deserves abuse." We must say, "There isn't something about me that makes you stalk or rape me. There's something about Ted, not something about Mary, that makes him think it's okay to do this. I'm not a child. I'm not an animal. I'm an adult with a right to a voice." And we must vow together that there will never be another season of silence. Thank you very much. Thanks. I think that the program committee wanted to have time for a Q&A. So if there are any questions, or especially if there are any answers, I'll be glad to hear them now.
Sara, can you tell us a little bit about some of the research you did for Hard Time? Because it was a difficult book to read, parts of it. And how did you...
Thanks. The question was about my most recent book, Hard Time. How did I do the research for it? How did I put it together? I started thinking about it when in Texas, a private prison company, the Corrections Corporation of America, had made some videos in which their guards were attacking male prisoners with 50,000-volt stun guns and laughing uproariously at the humiliation that the men endured. And I started thinking about the way in which privatization, which VI works in a world of white-collar crime, and when I write books, then there has to be sort of a white-collar crime that will be engaging enough to make me want to spend 18 or 24 months working on the book, and sort of it has to be substantial, and it has to be something that I can start feeling that I care about. And so that article, when it was broken in a Missouri paper because the prisoners were from Missouri, started me thinking about the issue of prison privatization. And I started thinking also about the ways in which, I mean, we incarcerate so many people in America, more than any other country in the world except maybe China, and that prison has started absorbing every dollar that we have available for social programs. And the trend really started in New York State when Governor Cuomo diverted $600 million that were supposed to be spent on public housing to use for building prisons. And other states saw what a good idea this was and began following suit. So I began thinking about all of those issues and started doing just really book research on prison. And I never actually was able to visit a prison. I met with some women who do a lot of pleadings for Illinois prison inmates, but they couldn't get me in. I've subsequently met people since the book was published who could have done it, but you know, it's a little late now for the book. But I met with them. They read the manuscript to sort of vet it for obvious faults. I met with women who had done time in the Illinois system, and it wasn't for the sake of, you know, like, oh, I was framed. It was just for, you know, this is what day-to-day life is like, just like the cockroaches. I read about the cockroaches, and then I heard about them, and I thought, I hope I am a brave enough person if I ever commit an act of conscience that ends up in a prison sentence not to renege, because those cockroaches would really get me down. And I read Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International both made women in American prisons the subject of major studies 2 years ago, and I relied on those. I wrote a piece on this, a short piece on this for Oprah Winfrey's Oxygen Network, and you can see the piece if you go on to oxygen. Can't remember if it's .com. I think it's .com, because there's a back file of all of the kind of pieces that are written. So rather than taking time now to go through it, but the piece does direct you to the URLs of where you can get that data and see it for yourself. It was a hard book to write. I had to let VI be vulnerable in a way that I guess I've often been so vulnerable in my own life that I've never wanted her to do that too. But I think she did something really important for me in being able to do that and show that you can remain fully human and that your spirit will not be destroyed, or you do not have to let your spirit be destroyed. Anything else? I know I went on a little longer than perhaps I should have, but I'll be glad to sign books for anyone who would like to have them signed.
Thank you all for coming.